Many people have joined us. Yes, we have. Wonderful. Sorry, everyone, for the little problem, the little delay in getting started there. We just seem to have a little problem, but good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on whereabouts you are in the world. Very nice of you to join us for this webinar. My name's Simon Blanchard, and I'm a partner at Data Protection Network. I've been working with personal data all my career, and I've been a partner with DPN for 9 years now, advising organisations, all kind of shapes and sizes, across a range of different sectors too, on data protection and privacy matters. We're a UK-based data protection consultancy, working with a wide range of organisations based in the UK and overseas across a wide range of kind of different sectors. We also run training workshops, and we offer practical guidance as well. We publish quite a lot of guidance materials on our website, and if you want to find out a bit more about that, that's dpnetwork.org.uk. Great, so I'm just going to pop a few slides on just to do some introductions. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint today, so it's just to kind of facilitate a few introductions. So this is our topic today. As I've said, know your data, data discovery and record keeping. So just first, we are actually recording the webinar, I should tell you. So if you'd like to review it again, or if you'd like to share it with some colleagues, then please go ahead. We'll drop you an email about it in about 24 hours time. You should hear from us with a link through to the recording. Some of you have kindly submitted some questions for us in advance as well, so thank you very much for that. There is also an opportunity to ask questions as we go, so there's a chat button provided for you to ask any questions. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say thank you to our partners for the webinar, our sponsor, which is Extero. So Extero empowers organisations to manage their legal governance, risk and compliance activities, requires proactively and defensively. So the legal GRC platform software is the only comprehensive platform that automates the complex interconnections of cybersecurity response, of digital investigations, privacy, legal operations, cybersecurity response, compliance and information governance. So just moving on, I'd like to introduce you to the panel that we have with us. I'm going to start off with our chairperson, who's Robert, who you can see here. Robert's a very experienced and very well respected privacy lawyer. He's also senior counsel at Privacy Partnership Law and an outsourced DPO. So Robert, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Thank you very much. No, delighted to be moderating this event today, and look forward to interacting with everybody on the call.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. And I'd like to also introduce Tim Michinanisson, who's Group Privacy Officer at Flight Centre Travel Group. Tim, would you like to say anything for intro?
No, just great to be here and looking forward to getting the panel started.
Great stuff. Thank you. And last but not least is Nick Rich, who's Head of Engagement for UK and Ireland at Extero. Nick?
So, I was going to start with a 3-volume autobiography, but I suppose I shouldn't, given that everyone else has been so brief. Thank you very much for having us here today, and we look forward to talking about these issues and interacting with the audience very much so.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Great. So just to set the scene, as I said, it's only going to be very short. I've just got a couple of slides just to set the scene, really, to get us all on the same page. So as a quick refresher on the whole area of kind of data discovery and records of processing activity. So good data governance means that we need to understand what data we've got in the organisation, really, to understand the personal data that we hold, what it's being used for, the different purposes it's used for, who's actually looking after it, who's kind of data owners and responsible for that data. And obviously we're doing all this so that we can identify any privacy or security matter, for that matter, any risks that we may identify there, so that we can act on those. So under the UK and the EU GDPRs, organisations are required to create and maintain a record of processing activity, or a RoPA as it's commonly known. Particularly organisations that employ more than 250 people, and also smaller organisations. There's a narrow exemption for smaller organisations whose processing activity, so any that have got processing activity that might really affect the rights and freedoms of individuals. So things like, for example, special category data or other sensitive data, things like that would also be required to create a record of processing. Now, it's sometimes thought as quite a burdensome activity, but the reality is, I think also that there's many benefits in understanding the processing that you're doing across the business. So to be able to identify the privacy and security risks, as we said, but also if you receive a subject access request or if you suffer a data breach, it's an invaluable resource, as again, I think we'll talk about in a few moments. But as I said, it can be quite challenging to potentially to create or to manage your records. So again, identifying all the places that personal data is stored across organisations and through the network of organisations that you might use to process it as well, particularly if you're a larger business and trading overseas or managing data overseas. And it does require obviously a large amount of buy-in from across the business and can be quite time-consuming and resource-intensive to bring it all together. The requirements themselves are complex and maybe seen as quite onerous, and it's also might not be so easy to keep your records fully up to date. But again, we'll talk about that in this session. The idea is to try and help you find ways to achieve it. That's what it's all about this session. So we'll also talk about what does proportionality mean. Again, a word that's commonly used when we're talking about GDPR. How do organisations take a proportionate approach to managing their data and to keeping records? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Robert to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And one of the questions that we had in is around the value of data mapping to the organization. We hear about data flows, data mapping. I talk about understanding your data estate. Simon, why is it so valuable?
I mean, some of the reasons I've mentioned is that if you don't know where your data is and what it's being used for, it just makes life quite difficult, I think, from a privacy point of view, to be able to make sure that you've got the appropriate technical and organizational measures in place that that all organizations are required to have. But equally, just so from the point of view of, are those measures adequate? Are we doing enough to protect the data? And how do we manage things like subject access requests? How do we manage situations of a data breach, for example? Just having good record keeping, I think, is vital.
Tim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd go so far as to say that data mapping is probably the single activity you can undertake in a privacy program that will bring the greatest bang for your buck. I honestly, to me, it underpins, as Simon was alluding there, so many of the actual activities and your other compliance activities that if you put a little bit of thought into your data mapping, if you needed to start somewhere and you had a program and you was like, there's so much to do, where do I begin? You start with your mapping. And if you put just a little bit of thought into it beforehand and say, okay, when we're going to collect, we need to create things like a RoPA, and we know we're going to use it for other activities. If we add just one or two little columns into however the mechanism we're using to collect the information, such as how long is the data being stored, which system is it in, what are the elements, you end up generating the underlying data that writes 90% of your RoPA that you can then use to generate your various programs, your DPIAs, your other assessments. So fundamentally, if you don't have that, you haven't undertaken a mapping process, you don't have a program, because you can't really complete a lot of the other compliance requirements. So fundamental would be the way I'd look at it.
And Nick, what about, is it a one-off activity or is it living and breathing?
That's a great segue, and I'd absolutely agree with what's been said so far. Data's a moving target. Most organizations find that the size and velocity and variety of data is going up over time. So knowing where everything was on the 13th of March last year is less and less helpful as time proceeds. So it's not just about doing a single data map to get to figure out where things are now. It's about putting in a process so that you can continue to understand how your data estate is evolving. There used to be an ad on American TV that said, do you know where your child is now? And it ran at about 10 p.m. or something like this. And you'd sort of hope in bed, tucked up asleep. And I think very much the same is is true of data, that there are a lot of corporations out there who are on a journey to being able to answer that question well, but who don't necessarily have, 100% of the answer to that by any means. So.
And I'm just interested, going back to you, Tim, when you look at understanding what you've got, do you do that for not just personal data, but do you do it for all information, all data?
No, only to the extent that I think it's the size of the organization we're in and the fact that we happen to be a global multinational company, that at some point you need to ring fence your privacy program and do your job in a sense. So we focus on what is identified as personal information, or however that is described under various privacy laws, and that's what we focus on. But I do totally would argue that if we had unlimited resources, yes, we would expand that into other areas with commercial data. And I think some organizations, based on their size, may want to do that if they have commercially sensitive information that just doesn't happen to be personal.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I find with a lot of the clients that I've worked with that the privacy or the personal data is spun out of general records management, and the business always had a records manager. What's your view on that, Simon?
Yeah, so I think it depends on really the nature of the business and the kind of processing that they do. I know clients in a similar position that you've described, Robert, that they have a records management program, and personal data is generally a very large part of that. But they want to get oversight of all of the data that they're managing to understand their commercial risk, their reputational risk, all of those kind of things, as well as their legal risks. But there's many others that are very much focused on GDPR and very much focused on the data protection risk, and take a similar approach that Tim suggested, because they can focus it within their privacy program. So I guess it's a bit horses for courses, really.
Yeah, and again, you find that you do need to know what you've got, whether it's personal data or just data, because that then impacts on your records retention policy. Because some will be personal data that you need to keep, and then other will be corporate records and tax information, and you mentioned, confidential and IP and so on. Tim, what do you think the RoPA as a process has been a good approach?
I think it's achieved the outcome. So I think the outcome is admirable, in that while we like to say all companies had a good record management process, let's face it, not all companies had a good record management process. So at least it focused and created a concrete compliance requirement to put that in place. And fair play to Article 30. It's very clear. It sets out, quite clear, if you're a controller, here's what you need to collect. If you're a processor, here's what you need to collect. So that's great. I think it's had a good effect. The question I always ask is, how much does it get viewed as just a tick box exercise and sit there? And similar to what Nick was saying, you need to refresh it, right? So it needs to be updated in accordance with when your data updates. And in most organizations, data is fairly dynamic. And do you know where your data is today versus 6 months ago? I would hazard that many companies may have a better idea of where their data is today. I'm not sure their record of processing would necessarily be updated as regularly as their data mapping, unless they have an automated process where one feeds and generates the other.
Yeah. And again, looking back, it's interesting. Before we had the GDPR, you registered with the ICO as a controller, and the ICO gave you a template that said, we assume for the type of business you're in that you collect this sort of data, that you keep it for that sort of period, that you share it with. And it's interesting, all the RoPA did was took away what used to be on the public register and put it in the hands of your business and said, well, now you're responsible for being accountable So you need to fill this thing in, and you need to make it live. So how useful is technology for this, Nick?
Oh, I think it can be a real boon. What we see actually is a lot of clients who are doing some kind of migration of data, and that's really the kickoff for doing something like this. So perhaps they're moving from on-premise systems to the cloud, or even if they're really ahead of the time, from the cloud back to on-premise systems. But in any case, either way, you tend to find that you've got terabytes or even petabytes of data, and you wish that when you'd first gone to using, Exchange, and I've heard many of my clients say this, I wish we put in a classification system when we started, but I now have this very large undifferentiated pile of stuff where some of it is gold dust, some of it is nonsense, some of it is personal, some of it is not. And before I move everything willy-nilly to the new place that it's going to go, maybe that's actually the time to do that tidy up classification, understanding and comprehension of what we've got, whether it's personal or, as you say, IP or tax records. And one interesting example I saw was someone who said, the real problem is I can have files called letter to granny.doc, and actually they're an invoice, and I can have invoices called, I can have files called invoice.doc, and actually they're a letter to granny. So I can't even really believe in the metadata on the file. I really actually have to go through what's actually in there. And if you're talking about a large volume of data, well, at that point, an automatic solution becomes absolutely necessary. You can't go through millions or billions of files by hand. It's just not going to be feasible. So you have to have something that can use the latest buzzwords, artificial intelligence, machine learning techniques to classify documents based on their actual content into the piles that you're interested in. You might have 300 or 400 different categories of personal information that you care about, whether it's credit card numbers or Uruguayan passport codes or whatever else it might be, and you need to apply those filters to the gamut of the data you've got, and that really does demand an automated solution. So
one of the things that again I'm seeing with clients is, particularly when we get aggressive weaponized subject access requests or rights of erasure, etc., that with hindsight you wished your system told you what was the lawful ground you relied upon when you collected that set of data, because the individual believes their right is absolute, and when we look at the law, it says no, there are instances where that data collected for that purpose does not need to be erased, or that data collected for that purpose does not need to be ported. Are we there yet, Simon, in being able to drill down to that level of detail, or should we be at that level of detail?
I think it certainly would be nice to be. I think in practice, I suspect that quite a lot of businesses are maybe not at that level of granularity, to be fair. Although one of the key things that we should be describing on a record of processing is what's our lawful basis. And again, as Tim said, this is the fundamental bit of it, isn't it, really? We need to make sure that all of our activity is lawful, and therefore we should have worked out what our lawful basis was. And therefore, when we get an erasure request, we should know what that is. We should be able to make those sort of decisions. But I think it might be worth me just mentioning at this stage, we did a survey last year in 22 of organisations and their record keeping and where are they at with that. And we found that there was just 25% of organisations that actually said, yes, we've got a full and complete up-to-date record. I don't know how up-to-date might be for those companies, but yes, in their view, it was up-to-date. 52% said, yes, we do have a record of processing, but actually it's not up-to-date. So they're having that real everyday challenge of how do we, productionize this, for want of a better word? How do we, make this into a living, breathing thing? 18% saying it was partially complete, and 5% admitting that they hadn't actually started. So I think it really is genuinely a challenge that organisations are facing, is, you know, both how do we go about collecting all that information, and then how do we, you know, manage the upkeep. But it's certainly something I think for businesses to aspire to, because there are a lot of benefits, I think, in doing that, both from, you know, it's a real challenge managing a privacy program without understanding both where your data is and how it flows as well, because it doesn't just come in one place and sit there. In the modern world, it's flowing between systems, into the business, out to suppliers, you know, service providers, perhaps processors, and then coming back into other systems, things like that. So data is not static. So yeah, certainly something we should all be working towards, I think.
And sort of going on from that, one of the other questions that we had was around the lessons learned from the COVID, working from home, working on multiple devices. Do you find, Tim, that that's been a challenge in getting to actually gather in all of that stuff that was centralized and is no longer?
Not as much as we had have expected. Like, it raises certainly other challenges from, yes, you're right, on how we even manage a distributed workforce from a technology perspective. So on that, its own set of challenges, but fundamentally, it doesn't change the data itself. So unless you're storing your data on those devices themselves in each individual location, as opposed to you may have some sort of thin client, or you are still working off centralized files, and it's just happens to be somebody sitting in Bristol where they were sitting in London before, but they're doing their same job. They would access the network as they would otherwise. In that situation, it doesn't really change anything. The data stays the same. So I'd say, you know, COVID had a lot of effects, but at least for our organization, it didn't have a big impact there. But I very much take the point that if you were storing data locally, it may have bigger challenges, but you still go back to the point, unless you're collecting new data and using it for new purposes, kind of where it happens to be sitting in that distributed workforce may have less of an impact than you think, so long as your records of processing are still accurate, saying we still collect the same data, people just happen to be sitting elsewhere where they're working from.
I think you're a very trusting person. I not so long ago had a situation where a young lady joined a workforce. Her job in HR was to take the copy of the degree certificate, the passport, the proof of identity, and scan them into the system. She decided it was much easier to walk downstairs into the car park, have a cigarette, and then take photos of them on her own device. 3 months later, it was only by chance that she admitted that all this stuff was there. And I do worry that we don't always think, you know, of managing the lowest common denominator, and that we think it's central, but it isn't. And I wonder whether, you know, that makes it a challenge to genuinely say, I know my stuff and where it is. Nick, thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a horrendous horrendous story, and I think that speaks to granularity again, right? That I hear clients who talk about the RoPA, and generally when they're doing that, I think you're not going into enough detail. And then I hear clients who talk about a RoPA per activity, right? And so if Simon decides to do a SurveyMonkey survey, then that actually creates an addition to the RoPA, right? I'm collecting some more information than I wasn't collecting it before. Here's where I'm collecting it from. This is why I'm collecting it. It's going into SurveyMonkey, which is in the States. Therefore, there's a data transfer impact assessment to be done, or not, et cetera, right? And everything's considered. So if you are doing things in that granular way, then you have a much better handle on young ladies and iPhones in the car park, potentially, than you do if you think of your RoPA as this single monolith that encompasses everything you're doing and can't possibly then have that sort of Sierpinski triangle-like detail that data actually has, if that makes some sense. So,
and following on from that, one of the questions is so what do we do about data processors? Do they need to keep a RoPA, Simon?
Yes, they do. Yeah, absolutely. And it's recognizing that actually data processors need to keep a record of all the processing that they're doing on behalf of their clients. But equally, they're going to be controllers in their own right for certain activity like employment, like marketing, perhaps sales, things like that. So they're most likely are going to need a controller record as well as a processor record, I would say.
And do you think it's fair due diligence to ask to see that processor's RoPA?
I've known a few clients that have asked to see that, yeah, from a due diligence perspective, exactly, because they want to really show that the supplier's got one more than anything. But I don't see it too often, if I'm honest, with clients. I don't know if either of you guys have had experience of that. I don't, again, Tim, do you ever ask businesses to provide a copy of their RoPA? I think quite a lot of people share it as well, to be fair.
Yeah, no, we don't. And I think this is probably going to go to a point, I would say, about the limitations of a RoPA. So I would say on the conversation up to now on the mobile phone, your RoPA doesn't control devices and it doesn't control what people does. It's just a record. You can't, if you've got a great RoPA, that's fantastic. You don't have a safe information security program. You don't have a safe compliance program. You've got a really good RoPA. So I think it has so many uses, but it's not going to protect people who are trying to use devices in different ways or not following other policies. That's why you have every other control for locking down devices and being able to control what people can do on these. So in that sense, I'd say we don't ask for it, mainly because, and I'm sure everybody on these call, a lot of people have experienced just how long and detailed security and privacy questionnaires and due diligence is becoming these days. When we get ones from banks as clients, everything from 800 to 1,000 questions is not unheard of, and in fact is becoming the norm. Even in those, though, we haven't been asked, and I'm pretty much across all of them for our clients globally, no one's asked to see our RoPA. And we don't ask to see the RoPAs for our vendors either. So I guess it comes down to horses for courses, and it's the position taken by the organization. For us, it's not higher up the scale of the work we have to do that I would think it worth the time. Yeah.
So one of the other questions we've got is on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the value of the RoPA in relation to the overall compliance program? I'll put that to you again, Tim.
Look, a solid 7.5. Your data mapping's a 10. Your RoPA is, I'd say, 7.5. Let me caveat that, Robert. If a regulator's asking you for it, it's a 10. And you really wish that you had one and it's right there in front of you to hand over. The rest of the time, though, there are often things that may be a bit more critical, and you need to be careful the RoPA doesn't get pushed too far down for updating it if it's not an automated process, etc. So you definitely want to have it. You need to have it. Where it kind of sits against competing priorities, though, is dependent upon the situation. Having said that, please make sure everyone has their RoPA. Yeah.
So, Nick, what thoughts on the same thing? And
I completely agree with Tim that the RoPA is not a prophylactic itself. It's simply something that can red flag, I've got passports going into the system here. Have I made sure I really know what's going on? And if you don't have that level of granularity, you're never going to notice. And I think that was the the point there. The question we have a sort of vendor risk compliance assessment module within our data inventory piece, and the thing I most get asked by clients is, does it actually go and measure the risk internally, right? It will reasonably say, yes, your supplier has got a statement saying they don't engage in modern slavery, and of course, what it doesn't, alas, do is sort of go and poke into their factory and check that that's really true, right? It checks that they've got the credential or that they've got the ISO 27001 that they say they have. And a number of our clients do ask for RoPAs, by the way, as part of that, I notice. But it obviously isn't in a position to then go and poke around and see how real things are. And I've had actually a lot of people say, well, I wish that existed. I would really like to know for sure that my supply chain is as clean as they say they are, because the thing that keeps me up at night is, my brand going south because my supplier has done something which I then get blamed for, so they'd love that to be the case. But as you can imagine, most vendors aren't, even if we had the tech, aren't going to let us into their network to go, or factory or wherever else, to physically go and poke around and see that they are signed up to the things they are. But that said, I put the same priority on the RoPA as Tim does, that data mapping definitely comes first, and that things like data retention definitely come behind a RoPA, in that things can go wrong if you over retain data, which is what most people do, but the risks of over retention are less than the risks of not knowing why you're collecting things. So I would definitely put it in the middle there at that solid 7.5. I think that's a great point.
And okay, so a comment from me, and then I'll get Simon to come back on it. I perhaps put it at least a 9 out of 10, because I see a living, breathing RoPA as something that produces red flags that then make you think, we need to update our privacy notice. We're suddenly now doing something that we weren't doing before. Or we're collecting data in an entirely different way. We fed that into the RoPA, but we don't say it in our privacy notice, and we haven't actually added that to our data retention schedule policy. So I think it's a highly valuable prompt, as well as being something you should have. I don't know what your thoughts are, Simon.
Very much with you on that, Robert. Yeah, I think you've hit a really important thing. So when we talked about the benefits a bit earlier, but actually what we're identifying here is that there's a load of other benefits that come out of the process of the creation and the updating of your records. So particularly, you spot situations, particularly I find this in organizations that have got quite distributed processing, either overseas with retail operations, or where there's lots of people involved in different locations, for example. So you can start to ask questions about, well, when we collected that data, did we actually minimize the data when we collected it? Do we actually have a lawful basis for that? How is the transfer secured? Are we making sure that we're receiving the data securely? So I think I certainly found, because I've worked with a number of clients on the whole creation of the RoPA and keeping it up to date, it raises so many things as you work through it. You find so many things that in my view, you wouldn't otherwise have known about. And that process is invaluable, I think, in just looking, if we think of it from the point of view of the accountabilities that we have as a business, the responsibilities that we have to meet. Transparency, as you said, Robert, is absolutely vital in this. So, being clear with people how we're using their data, both now and at the time that we collected it, the ways that that's evolved. It just allows us to review both the documents that we have and our own internal ways of working, and just make sure that the measures that we're using to protect that data, and asking ourselves if it's lawful, asking ourselves if it's fair, without having some method of data mapping and recording all of that, it's really hard to know where to start.
I'd add a part there if I can.
Yeah, sure.
I totally get where you're coming from. I think it's They are really, really good points, and I do agree. I'd say where there may be differences in per organization is the maturity of your program at the moment and at what stage you are doing those activities. So if you've got a good beta mapping in place and you have a solid RoPA and you're starting from that point, and any new activity is going through an assessment process, like a DPIA or an internal privacy impact assessment, and if you're doing privacy by design and security and privacy by design and default off the back of that, you can capture it, I think, before it gets to the RoPA. So you can know to update because you know something new is being developed by your teams. We're going to do an assessment at this. We'll use that to actually feed into the privacy notice at that point, and we'll update the RoPA. Again, I think it really comes down to how your organization has managed its end-to-end processes. Otherwise, you may be using the RoPA before those assessments, in which case it's like, okay, we're backfilling an assessment because it's come through on our RoPA, and that itself raises some concerns as to whether one's the horse and one's the cart, and which one should have happened first.
And just while you were talking there, I see that there's a question come in. It's not directly related to this, but Luke, I'll pick that one up before we finish. On the basis of what we've just been discussing, we see and we hear in the draft Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that the government is going to broadly do away with the requirement for a RoPA. It's somehow burdensome for enterprises and businesses. There's been all sorts of reasons why that is going to happen. Let's assume that the bill does become law. Would you, Tim, keep your RoPA even though you don't have to?
For our organization, we would keep it because we still have to. And that comes down to RoPAs aren't just required under UK GDPR and EU GDPR. So our presence is global. So even if the UK says, okay, we do away with it, we've still got our European businesses. We're still going through that process. We've got our South African businesses, and there's a requirement under PAPIR. Under new legislation that's sort of in the works, the Australian update to the Privacy Act, the recommendations within the drafts there are to add a RoPA in, which they've not had in the past. Whether or not that actually comes through in the final draft, we'll just have to wait and see. But that was one of the, so I'm worried if the UK takes that step and thinks, okay, we'll remove it. If you're just a UK-based company and that's all you do and that's your consumer base, happy days, great. You can remove that. You're losing the benefits that we've talked about. But from a compliance, it's something you don't have to do. If you're crossing borders, though, into those other markets that require it, I think you need to be very careful just saying, well, we'll switch it off in the UK and we'll leave it elsewhere, because what is it going to be an up-to-date record?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you might be a UK-only business, but if you're doing stuff internationally, you'll have extraterritoriality applying from all over the place. I mean, Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there can't be that. Well, I don't know how many UK businesses there are whose are of the size affected by this, whose marketplace will be and is UK only. But that's got to be only a percentage of the economy, right? And I think many firms will find that they're still banned by certainly EU GDPR and the other and more jurisdictions that are bringing similar legislation in place. And the other risk there, of course, is the data adequacy requirements, because I'm speaking out of turn as not a legal expert at all, but it does seem to me that if we change things enough, then other jurisdictions may cease to see us as an adequate host of data, and that in itself could cause all kinds of problems to companies here. So my guess is that will be made clear, and things might be watered down when it, or my hope, I suppose, is that things might be watered down when it comes to it. I don't know, but I certainly defer to the more legally knowledgeable people on this particular call on that. But I suspect it seems that's a real risk that needs to be understood by the government in any legislation they bring through, doesn't it? So,
yeah. What do you think, Simon?
Yeah, I think that's a fair call. I agree. We've got to consider adequacy and maintaining adequacy. That's really a key point. But I think just one thing I wanted to add about the Data Protection Digital Information Bill around record keeping is that there is still a requirement, one, to have a privacy management program. And there is still a requirement in that to have a record keeping element within that. But I think it's just trying to reinforce a proportionate approach. So for smaller businesses, they're going to have more flexibility. But I very much take the point that you guys have both made about the fact that there's so many businesses, of course, that are managing they've got the data of European citizens, let alone citizens based overseas as well, based outside of Europe too. So from that point of view, there's still going to be a need to have records. There's still going to be a need to cover the activities we've been talked about. So there's going to be a need for a record in some form, but it will give those businesses that are UK centric the opportunity then to maybe be a bit more flexible about the way that they record that information. And it might not be so onerous for them. They'll have to decide actually how they do that. I think is the way it's looking.
Yeah, and I will just add that this morning I was at a meeting where I've been told that the intention is the third reading of the bill is going to happen in October. That there will be an assent at some point with probably a final version in March. Yeah. What I don't know is whether anybody will listen to things that we're talking about and saying, actually, we should keep a RoPA, or we should revisit this senior responsible individual / DPO and a whole range of things because of that adequacy concern. But it seems to me that the government is hell-bent on pushing this one through, and getting this done before there's a change of government or an election at any rate. And we're all here dealing with compliance, and I think everybody has said it's a valuable tool, and it leads into other things. I mean, Simon's mentioned retention in general, but I think your RoPA does ask you to indicate how long you will keep certain categories of data for, whether it's special category or whatever. And it must drive you to go, what does our retention policy say? Do we have an effective means of destruction? And, one of the questions we've had in, which I will come to now, is where do we see AI helping here or challenging here? I'll go to you, Nick, first.
Yes, well, so I think we were sort of in the AI winter for very, very many years, and then we've had a decade of AI all at once in January 23, right? And we're still looking at the fallout from that massive improvement in generative AI capability, and I think it remains to be seen what all the impacts of that will be, but I think they will be massive. It is a huge step change in what you could expect AI to do. And I think, in other spaces that we're in, things like e-discovery and forensic investigation, machine learning and classifiers have been used now for many years successfully to, reduce the amount of documents people need to look at, eyes on for lawyers and so on and so forth. But the ability to do really high quality summarization, to challenge and make arguments about documents automatically, and those sorts of capabilities allow for a step change in what the tools can do for us. And so what that means is that I think it's commonplace that lots and lots of companies have retention schedules, and very few of them are in a position to actually implement them at the moment, right? And there's this horrible asymmetry of risk. You just don't want to be the person who deleted some data that the CEO wants to see next week. But on the other hand, if you leave that filing cabinet full of data, it's cost and risk, right? And it's stuff that you arguably should have got rid of. So the risk falls on the corporate. But there's a sort of asymmetric risk for individuals within the corporate in actually deleting things. And I think one of the things that better AI tools will give us is an ability to trust the automation of deletion schedules, so that we can say we've set some rules and we know that those rules can actually be followed in a pretty reasonable way. We aren't going to throw anything away that we really should have kept. But we are going to be able to cut down the amount we keep unnecessarily enormously by having better tools that, to say they understand content is wrong. They're not understanding content, but they do a simulacrum of understanding content well enough that we can say that we can trust the system to get rid of things for us. And I think that will enable a much better ability to maintain a retention schedule in the way it's designed.
That's interesting. Thank you, Tim. Any comments on that topic?
Yeah, I think AI, yes, it's going to be incredibly disruptive, and it's going to be fantastic for organizations, and organizations, especially those that make good use of enterprise AI solutions, as opposed to unprotected sort of freeware versions, which aren't free, depending on how you want to look at your data. The limitation, though, which is going to exist, leaving aside the values of the forensics and the checking, is just from a day-to-day working. The benefit is, it's, if you link it into your data lakes, is you're having this ability to make all of your information available to all of your staff all of the time, to who, without necessarily upskilling your staff, but to be able to make queries and be able to produce and generate that data. The challenge for us as privacy professionals is now you've got all of your data available to all of your staff all of the time. AI, what it can't do is do your tagging for you of the data, to put in place the boring data governance component at the lower level, which then it will link in, which AI would be great to be able to then link into roles-based access controls. And it will generate and show and analyze only the data that person needs to perform their role, which assists all of our programs, right? So that part hasn't gone away. And in discussions with some AI providers, they've acknowledged that. So we've been in these discussions with them, and they've said, yeah, to get full value out of AI, you've still got to tag your data. And if you haven't done that, you're not really going to be able to implement strong controls and access controls and role-based controls. That problem remains. So,
okay. And I'm going to turn to Simon next for this question, and it might well be the last one we've got that's come in prior to this, and that is, does the panel have any tips on how to make this all more achievable? Some of our teams don't seem interested. And I know in the past, Simon, you've done surveys and said, here's the challenges that the DPO has, etc. So do you want to comment on that one? How do we make it more achievable? How do we engage?
It's a good point. And I think particularly for maybe smaller organizations, then it really is genuinely a challenge to bring all of this information together and to do the data mapping and the record keeping that we've been talking about. We have to recognize that is a challenge, and our survey did point that out. So I think one key thing is having an understanding of the benefits that we've been talking about, but to really make sure that you've got that buy-in. So there is very much a process, I think, of working with your management teams, working with your SLT or executive or whatever it be, to understand that it's a foundational activity. As again, we talked about quite a lot of this, to be able to understand the data. We can't govern the data unless we know what data we've got, where it is, who's using it for what. And as we've been talking about AI there, that's going to get more complex as time goes on, as more businesses are adopting more innovative ways of using the data. It's all going to get faster. It's all going to get, and potentially, therefore, the risk of that being unfair, unlawful, discriminatory, all of those things could be there. So I think we need to get that buy-in. Really, this is what it's all about for me, and that's not just buy-in at the around the boardroom and the exec, that we need this kind of activity and we need resources to do it, potentially technology to help us do it, but equally we need the teams themselves to be involved. Your heads of each function, your HR function, your marketing functions, all production, be it whatever it be, to be supportive in helping us to get access to that information. We'll need time equals time. So I think take the time to get the buy-in and to sing about the benefits, really, that we'll get from it, because there will need to be time invested to do it. But certainly I think the feedback that we've been talking about today is that that's worth doing.
And we did have one question in, and because I said that we will answer it, before I get you to close, any closing thoughts you've got, I'm going to ask, I'm sorry to drop Simon in this one, but I'm sure he might throw it back to me. But the question is, I work with a recruitment business, and sometimes our consultants make educated guesses about persons' email addresses to see if they would be interested in a vacant role. Does guessing somebody's address and then processing it constitute a risk or even a breach?
I think it does, yes, because your key challenge really here is if you could probably guess someone's address, email address. Quite often, if you know the domain name, you're going to be able to therefore put a dot in the middle of their name and the surname and have a reasonable chance that you've got that right, especially if you know other people's email addresses. But the challenge that it gives you, I think, is transparency is a key thing. The fact that the individual doesn't know that you've done it, and they suddenly, they may then presumably are going to get an email about recruitment. I'll be honest, I still get these. I didn't sign up with a recruitment agency for years, but I still get recruitment agencies contacting me, and I always go back to them and say, so where did you get my data from? And why have you still got it? So this is actually a bit of a challenge, I find, in the recruitment area. Apologies to the person that's put this forward. Sorry, I don't know if it's a gentleman or lady. I couldn't catch what you said there, Robert. But I think that is a bit of a challenge in the recruitment world, to be honest, that I've seen myself, because I've been contacted in that situation. So it's the challenge of, is the individual expecting it? And if not, they might complain. So where do you stand if you get a subject access request or an erasure request or anything like that? And particularly, are you running the risk of upsetting them? Of course, a lot of those people might well be happy with the contact. I appreciate that. But is there a risk? Yes, I think there is.
And I guess a lesson there is when you're doing your data mapping, the who, what, when, where, why, you would be bound to be saying, where on earth, why have we got this? How long have we been storing information to which we can find no lawful ground for having it? So going back to the topic, record keeping, RoPA, any closing remarks from you, Tim?
Yeah, I'll touch on that question that was asked before on how to make it easier. So if it was just going to be one tip, it's if you're going to do your data mapping as your starting point, a little bit of pre-thought will help you basically generate at least today's RoPA. You'll still have to get it going forward. So just look at Article 30. The controller and the processor, every organization is unless you're just a controller, you're probably going to have both elements. And if you're a processor, yes, your internal staff, you're going to be a controller for. It gives you a list of information to be collected. Simply fold that into your data mapping process and then do your data mapping. You've done the heavy lifting if you complete your data mapping, that you'll literally be able to generate at least your version 1 of your RoPA straight away. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. That's a way that you can at least kickstart the process if you haven't.
Yep. Super. Nick.
So, without wishing to become too advertorially, I think one of the nice features of some of the software we have is its reliance on dashboards. And what dashboards do is enable information to be surfaced to non-specialists in a way that they can really understand. So they can see perhaps a map of data transfers, or a list of processing activities, or a list of legislation that's been triggered by various processing activities, and so on. And so what we find often is that DPOs who are perhaps struggling to get the rest of the organization interested in or to understand what it is they're doing, with a dashboard in hand, a nice pretty thing on the web. We all know managers who require 3D visualizations of things, right? And that really helps in getting the message across and getting some buy-in that, actually, if you do this, you'll see the results and you'll be able to get some of the value out of it as well. It's not just the high priesthood of privacy professionals who are winning here by any means.
Super. And good comment has come in just in the last minute from Scott, saying RoPA has helped us reduce applications by illustrating we already had the data. Why do we need another copy? As a small charity, it's difficult to find the time, but it's worth the effort. And with that, I'm going to hand back to you, Simon, and say thank you to the panel.
Brilliant. Yes, I'll just echo that. Thank you, Robert, too. And thank you to Nick. Thanks, Tim. That's been a really interesting discussion, I think, today. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Don't have anything to add in terms of closing content, because we've gone through quite a bit, other than just to remind everyone, if you weren't aware, that we do have other events like this. We do quite regular webinars. In fact, I think my colleague Phil's just posted on there a link to the other events that we've got coming up in 19th September and 11th of October. So we're just about up to the hour. So thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.